Project Planning and Control, PP&C Risk, Execution and Communication, Managing the Full Picture Course, 4 Module 1. Course 4 Module 1, Risk Assessment, QRA, SRA, and JCL. Every program has risks. The question is whether they are quantified, understood, and reflected in the reserves and schedule. This module is about how I look at risk as an integrator, not as a risk owner, but as the person who looks across all risks and asks whether the reserves are adequate and correctly timed. At JPL and Skunkworks, I saw the same failure pattern repeatedly. Programs that had a risk register but never connected it to the cost and schedule baseline. The register was a list, not a management tool. This module fixes that. After this module, you'll be able to read a QRA S-curve and assess whether UFE is sufficient and correctly timed, explain what an SRA adds that a QRA does not, and identify the difference between a risk and a lien and why that distinction matters for reserve planning. Risk quantification is mandatory for programs above the JCL threshold. If you cannot explain the reserve posture in probabilistic terms, you cannot defend it at a government review. By the end of this module, you'll understand how to evaluate and manage program risk using the tools and techniques commonly applied across government and aerospace programs. You'll learn to distinguish different types of risks, assess reserve adequacy, interpret quantitative and schedule risk assessments, and understand the role of joint confidence levels and technical performance measures. Most importantly, you'll be able to integrate cost, schedule, risk, and technical performance information into meaningful assessments that support informed, risk-based decision-making. This module header sets the frame. Risk assessment is not just about identifying what might go wrong. It is about quantifying it well enough to hold an informed conversation with leadership about whether the reserves are adequate. Gus Grissom's quote applies directly. Programs that treat risk as a paperwork exercise, populating registers to satisfy a requirement, tend to find out what real risk looks like at the worst possible moment. The conquest of any complex program is worth doing right. JCL is the mechanism that forces the cost estimate, the schedule, and the risk register to tell the same story simultaneously. If any one of those three inputs is weak, the JCL output is unreliable regardless of how sophisticated the model is. My job in this module is to make sure you understand QRA and SRA well enough to use them as decision tools, not just compliance checkboxes. The integrator's role in risk differs from that of the risk owner. Risk owners manage their own risks. My job is to look across all of them, understand how they interact, and identify whether the aggregate picture makes sense. I have supported program managers, instrument managers, and review boards in exactly the ways listed here. The through line is always the same. Someone needs to sit above the individual risk owners and ask whether the overall posture is defensible. The most common gap I see is the last bullet. Analysts who understand individual risks but have never asked how they interact. Two 15% probability risks in the same schedule window can create a combined exposure that is far higher than either alone. When you're in the room with a program manager evaluating risk, your value is the cross-risk perspective. Anyone can read the register. Not everyone can synthesize it. The precise definition of risk matters because it determines what goes into the reserve and what is not. A risk is a future event with some probability of occurring. The moment probability reaches 100%, it is no longer a risk. It is a problem and requires a different response. The most underappreciated items on this slide are liens and threats. Programs that only track formal risks and ignore liens and threats consistently underestimate their true cost exposure. I have watched programs where the reserve looked adequate against the risk register, but was completely consumed by items that were never registered. The taxonomy here, liens, threats, watch items, candidate risks, opportunities, is the real-world language of reserve management. Know what each category implies for timing and probability before you size the UFE. If a program tells you it has adequate reserves, Ask them to reconcile the reserve against the full taxonomy, not just the formal risk list. That conversation will tell you everything you need to know. Risk management exists to ensure that the reserve structure reflects reality. The three questions on this slide are: have risks been retired? Is burn down consistent with design principles? And how is UFE being used? The analyst's monthly risk assessment checklists are also included. Reserve burn down consistency is the first thing I check. If a program is 40% through its schedule and has burned 70% of its UFE, that is a signal regardless of what the risk register says. The trajectory matters more than the snapshot. The sources of UFE consumption listed here, scope change, growth, workmanship issues, and risk mitigation are the same categories that show up in variance analysis. When you see unexplained cost growth, one of these is almost always the driver. Every month, you should be able to answer the question, is the UFE burn down proportional to the risk of retirement? If risks are closing, but UFE is not declining proportionally, something is being misclassified or mislabeled. Liens are the most important category to understand because they are the most frequently ignored. A lien is an impact that is certain or nearly certain to occur. The only uncertainty is the exact size. That certainty means it should not be in the risk register. It should be in the cost baseline. The administrator edict example on this slide happened at JPL. A schedule change was imposed from above, and the program continued to treat the resulting cost impact as a risk rather than a lien. By the time the review board caught it, the program was 18 months behind where the reserve model said it should be. Threats are cost-only items with medium to high probability. They must be included in the QRA, even if they are not in the formal risk register. Watch items are the catch-all category, and how a program uses them tells you a lot about the quality of their risk management process. When you review a risk register, sort by category first. If the lien column is empty, but the program has a directed schedule change on the books, the register is incomplete. Candidate risks and opportunities complete the taxonomy. Candidate risks are the items the program knows about but has not yet fully characterized. Opportunities are choices that, if acted on, can increase UFE. Both affect the reserve calculation. Management challenges are the category that gets programs in the most trouble. When the estimate exceeds the budget and the scope is accepted anyway, with everyone hoping it works out, that is not a risk, it is a structural deficit. It needs to be surfaced, not hoped away. New scope additions almost always drive other changes. Anytime a scope is added to a program, ask immediately what the cost impact is and whether the risk register has been updated to reflect the new exposure. The common thread across these categories is that they all affect UFE. Every item in every category needs to be reflected in the reserve posture, or the reserve is understated. The car analogy makes a point that applies directly to program management. Reducing cost does not automatically reduce risk. In many cases, it increases it. The cheapest option and the lowest risk option are frequently not the same thing. I have seen this exact pattern on programs that chose the low-cost contractor bid. The cost savings were real. The risk increase was also real, and it materialized. By the time the problem surfaced, the savings have been consumed 3 times over in rework and schedule recovery. When a program presents a cost reduction that looks attractive, the first question is, what is the corresponding risk impact? If there is no answer to that question, the cost reduction is not fully characterized. Cost and risk move together. Never evaluate a proposed saving without simultaneously evaluating what it does to the probability and consequence of the risks it introduces. The 5x5 matrix is the standard visualization for risk probability versus consequence. Every cell in the matrix maps to a color, green, yellow, or red, and that color determines who owns the risk and how much management attention it requires. The numbers in the cells on this slide are actual risk items from program. Notice how the distribution tells a story, where the cluster is what the dominant consequence range is and whether the program has outliers in the red zone. A blank matrix is a compliance document. A populated matrix is a program health indicator. Always ask what the matrix looked like at the previous review. The movement of risks across the matrix over time is more informative than the current snapshot. Risks moving toward red without corresponding increases in UFE are a warning sign. The matrix informs the QRA. Every risk's position, its probability, and consequence score feed the Monte Carlo simulation that produces the S-curve. Get the risk scoring wrong, and the QRA output is fiction. This historical data from 14 robotic missions shows that risk counts increase from PDR to CDR by roughly 2x, then decline. That pattern is not random. It reflects when design decisions get made and when technical unknowns get resolved. The 7x increase label on this chart refers to a subset of missions that had particularly aggressive risk accumulation. At JPL, we track this pattern closely. A program that is not seeing the expected risk increase through phase CPDR is either managing risk exceptionally well or not looking hard enough. This data is the benchmark. When I am reviewing a program's risk posture, I compare its risk count trajectory against this historical pattern. A program that shows flat or declining risk counts through CDR without clear evidence of retirement is almost certainly underreporting. Use this chart in reviews. When a program presents a risk register with only 12 items on a $500 million program, this historical data gives you the basis to push back. Most risks should be mitigated, but mitigation comes at a cost, and there is no guarantee it will work. The decision to mitigate is an economic decision and requires the same rigor as any other investment decision in the program. The sequential approach matters. The least expensive mitigations first. This is not just about saving money. It is about preserving options. If you spend the entire mitigation budget on a single approach that fails, you have no fallback. Multiple mitigation steps are common and appropriate. Each step should be documented, costed, and tracked as a deliverable in the IMS. A mitigation plan that exists only in the risk register with no corresponding scheduled activities is aspirational, not executable. When reviewing a risk register, look for risks flagged as mitigated that have no cost recorded and no scheduled task. That combination usually means the mitigation is a hope, not a plan. The whiz-bang example is designed to make a counterintuitive point. A large mitigation investment against a low-probability risk can be the wrong decision even when the total risk value is enormous. This is one of the most important analytical skills in risk management, the ability to calculate whether a mitigation investment is economically rational given the probability. A 5% probability risk that costs $100 million to mitigate by 90% is not a good use of reserves if the UFE impact at the 50% confidence level is small. The calculation here, 5% probability risk, $100 million mitigation reduces the probability to 0.5%. If the risk only appears above the 95th percentile in the QRA, spending $100 million to push it to the 99.5th percentile does not improve the 50th or 70th percentile outcomes that the JCL measures. Always frame mitigation decisions in terms of their impact on the confidence level curve, not just the raw risk value. The question is not whether the risk is large. The question is whether the mitigation changes the JCL outcome at the point that matters. Random probability assignment, even within a narrow range, such as 1% to 5%, can significantly alter the aggregate risk picture. This is the analytical basis for why subjective probability scoring requires discipline and calibration. Programs that assign probabilities informally, without historical calibration or structured elicitation, tend to cluster their risks in the 1 to 5% range regardless of actual likelihood. The result is a risk register that consistently underestimates aggregate exposure. Tripling the 50th percentile impact value through random assignment in a narrow band is not a theoretical concern. It happens on real programs when probability assignment is treated as a judgment call rather than an analytical exercise. When you see a risk register in which every risk has a probability between 1% and 5%, that signals the scoring has not been calibrated. Push for a structured probability elicitation process, or, at a minimum, a challenge session where each probability is defended. The NOAA spacecraft was dropped during a routine repositioning operation because bolts that should have been in place had been removed by another project while the cart sat in a common staging area. The operation had been characterized as low risk. This story illustrates the most dangerous category of risk, the one that has never happened before. Programs consistently underweight risks that have no historical precedent, precisely because there is no data to point to. But the absence of prior occurrence is not evidence of low probability. It is evidence of limited experience. The systemic failure here lay in the interface between programs that share common facilities. The risk register addressed the spacecraft. It did not address what happens when another team removes hardware from shared cart. That gap, the inter-program interface risk, is one of the hardest to capture and one of the most consequential. Every time I review a risk register, I ask, what are the interface risks between this program and everything around it? Facilities, shared tooling, concurrent operations, contractor handoffs. The NOAA failure lived entirely in that gap. This image shows the actual NOAA spacecraft after the drop incident, a physical illustration of what a single procedural failure on a supposedly low-risk operation can produce on a nearly complete, expensive spacecraft. The damage to the NOAA cost approximately $135 million to repair and significantly delayed the launch. The bolt removal that caused it took minutes. The recovery took years. That ratio, seconds of exposure to years of consequence, is the reason risk management cannot be treated as an administrative function. Look at this image when you're tempted to categorize an operation as routine. Routine means it has been done successfully before. It does not mean the conditions are identical to every previous time, or that every safeguard is in place, or that no one around you has changed something in the environment. The NOAA story is the concrete answer to the question of why we do this work. This is what happens when risk management is treated as a documentation exercise rather than an active analytical discipline. A quantitative risk assessment calculates the probability that a program's cost will come in at or below a target value. Using probability-weighted risk values summed across all identified risks, liens, threats, and opportunities. The math here is straightforward. The sum of risks is $1.1 billion. Multiply each by its probability, and the expected value is $498 million. The UFE needs to be positioned to cover not just the expected value, but enough of the distribution to achieve the required confidence level. The distinction between risk, QRA, lien, threat, opportunity, and UFE is not academic. Each category feeds the QRA differently and has distinct implications for when and how the reserve is needed. Mixing them up produces a QRA output that looks precise, but is built on a flawed input structure. The QRA is only as good as the inputs. A mathematically rigorous Monte Carlo run on incomplete or subjectively scored risks produces a number that gives false confidence. The analytical work is in the inputs, not the tool. The key insight on this slide is timing. It is not enough to have adequate total UFE. The UFE must be available when the risks are most likely to materialize. A reserve that is backloaded when front-loaded risk exposure exists is functionally inadequate, even if the total number looks right. I have reviewed programs where the total UFE passed the JCL test at 70%, but the phasing was completely misaligned with the risk profile. The reserves were concentrated in the back half of the program. The risks were concentrated in integration and test, which was the front half of what remained. The program ran out of room to maneuver before the scheduled UFE was available. QRAs quantify cost risk. They do not quantify schedule risk. That is the boundary condition on this slide. Remember it. A program can pass the cost QRA and still have a schedule problem that drives cost events that were not modeled. Always ask, where's the UFE phased relative to when the risks are most likely to occur? A risk register with heavy exposure in INT requires a UFE profile that is weighted toward the INT period. This slide makes the timing problem concrete. If a risk occurs and the UFE to cover it is not yet available in that period, the program has to defer content. Deferred content affects the schedule. Scheduling costs money. A cost reserve problem has just become a schedule problem. The cascade here is real, and I have seen it multiple times. A $15 million risk materializes in month 14. The UFE profile shows $20 million available in month 22. The program defers a procurement to cover it. The deferred procurement delays a vendor delivery. The vendor delivery was on the critical path. The launch slips 6 months. The phrase on this slide, "program has serious issues," understates the problem. A program with adequate total reserves but wrong timing is not in a better position than a program with inadequate total reserves. Both will be replanning. Reserve phasing analysis should be a standing agenda item at every monthly program review. Total UFE is one number. UFE available this quarter against risks likely this quarter is the number that matters operationally. Programs often only quantify the top risks, the ones that are already well understood and well characterized. By doing so, they systematically underrepresent the true risk posture because the long tail of smaller, less visible risks frequently drives higher aggregate costs than the top items. I have sat in reviews where the program presented the top 10 risks and explained why each was being managed. The QRA looked clean. 3 months later, a cost event occurred that was not on the list at all. It was a candidate risk that had never been elevated. The top risks only QRA had given everyone false confidence. The tornado chart reference on the next slide is the tool for addressing this. A full risk set, not just the top items, needs to feed the Monte Carlo simulation for the QRA to be credible. Anytime a program presents a QRA based on a subset of identified risks, ask for the coverage percentage. What fraction of all known risks is included? If the answer is less than 80%, the QRA is probably understating exposure. Top risks are subjectively selected, which means political factors, organizational dynamics, and the maturity of individual risk items all influence what appears on the list. The tornado chart is the analytical tool that cuts through the subjectivity by quantifying the uncertainty around each risk contribution to the S-curve. I have used tornado charts to surface risks that were not on the top 10 list, but were driving significant spread in the QRA output. When you show a program manager that a risk ranked 14th on the register is the third largest driver of schedule uncertainty, the conversation changes. The combination of the tornado chart and the S-curve gives you both the aggregate picture and the individual driver picture. Use both. The S-curve tells you whether the reserve is adequate. The tornado tells you where to focus mitigation investment. If a program gives you a QRA with no tornado chart, ask for one. The S-curve alone tells you the confidence level. The tornado tells you what to do about it. The schedule risk assessment is the probabilistic counterpart to the QRA, where the QRA quantifies cost risk through probability-weighted cost impacts. The SRA quantifies schedule risk through Monte Carlo simulation of the IMS with probability-weighted duration uncertainties. The SRA and QRA need to be done together, not in isolation. Schedule slips cost money, and that cost needs to feed back into the QRA. Programs that run these two analyses independently produce a JCL that double counts some risks and misses the interaction effects entirely. The SRA requires a logic-linked, resource-loaded IMS to produce credible results. If the schedule is not properly integrated, the Monte Carlo simulation will produce output that appears precise but lacks a solid analytical basis. Before I accept any SRA output, I check the quality of the underlying IMS. A strong SRA built on a weak schedule is a false precision exercise. The SRA provides 4 distinct outputs: risk reduction guidance, schedule validation, early warning of problems, and quantification of the required schedule reserve. All four are needed, not just the probability number. The early warning function is the one program that users use least and need most. A well-maintained SRA that is updated monthly will show you schedule problems forming 2 to 3 months before they appear in the status reports. That lead time is the difference between managing a problem and reacting to a crisis. Schedule reserve sizing from the SRA should be compared against what the program actually holds. A program whose SRA says it needs 6 weeks of schedule reserve but whose IMS shows only 2 weeks of float has a credibility problem at the next milestone review. Make the SRA a living document. Programs that run the SRA once at PDR and never update it are using a snapshot from the past to manage the present. The probabilistic SRA uses the IMS logic network and 3-point estimates. Minimum, most likely, maximum for activity durations, then runs Monte Carlo simulations to determine the probability distribution of completing the program by any given date. The 3-point estimate is where most of the analytical value lives. Programs that use symmetric triangular distributions for all activities are using a shortcut that underestimates right-tail risk. Development activities in aerospace almost always have asymmetric uncertainty. Things rarely finish early, but frequently finish late. The COTS tools listed here, Risk Plus, At Risk, and Primavera Risk Analysis, all implement the same underlying methodology. The choice of tool is less important than the quality of the inputs and the integrity of the IMS logic that the simulation runs on. When reviewing SRA results, ask to see the distribution shape assumptions for the top 20 activities on the critical path. If every activity has a symmetric distribution, the analysis is probably understating schedule risk. The SRA is a quantitative analysis of the probability of meeting schedule commitments, evaluating uncertainty, risk events, and critical path vulnerabilities. It is the input to the schedule component of the JCL. The connection to JCL is the key integration point. The JCL is not a separate analysis done after the QRA and SRA. It is the synthesis of both. Cost, risk, and schedule risk interact. A schedule slip that requires overtime to recover creates a cost event. That linkage must be explicit in the JCL model. Margin allocation is one of the direct outputs. How much schedule reserve is needed at what confidence level? The SRA answers that question quantitatively. Programs that set a schedule reserve by rule of thumb, say 15% of the remaining duration, are not using the information available to them. The SRA should drive the schedule reserve decision, not validate a number that was already decided. Run the SRA first, then set the reserve. 3 inputs drive the SRA. The IMS, with logic linkage and resource loading. The risk register, with likelihood and duration mapped to scheduled tasks. And historical performance data combined with expert judgment. The critical requirement here is that risks must be mapped to specific schedule activities, not just to the program as a whole. A risk that says it will add 6 weeks to the program without specifying which activities it affects cannot be properly modeled. The SRA simulation needs to know where in the schedule the impact lands. Expert calibration is the input that gets the least attention and matters the most. Historical productivity rates from similar programs provide the anchor for the 3-point estimates. Without that calibration, the estimates are opinions dressed as analysis. Before accepting SRA results, verify that every risk on the register has been mapped to one or more specific schedule activities. Unlinked risks produce underestimated schedule exposure. The SRA process has 3 phases: preparation, quantification, and simulation. Each phase has specific deliverables, and skipping or shortcutting any phase degrades the quality of the output. IMS validation before running the simulation is non-negotiable. An IMS with open-ended, dangling activities or illogical constraints will produce Monte Carlo output that does not reflect the actual structure of the schedule. Garbage in, garbage out applies with full force here. The uncertainty distribution choice, triangular, beta, or uniform, affects the output significantly for long-tail risk events. For most aerospace development activities, I recommend starting with triangular distributions calibrated to historical data, then testing the sensitivity of the top critical path drivers to the distribution assumption. Document every input assumption and distribution choice. When the SRA produces a result that is questioned, you need to be able to show exactly what assumptions drove it and why they are defensible. The SRA produces three categories of output: probability level schedule forecasts, risk driver identification through sensitivity analysis, and decision products including recommended schedule margin and mitigation triggers. The tornado chart in the SRA outputs is as important as the S-curve. The S-curve tells you the confidence level of the current plan. The tornado tells you which activities and risks are driving the most spread. That is where mitigation investment should be focused. Mitigation triggers are the output that most programs ignore. The SRA can tell you that if this activity slips by more than 2 weeks, the probability of meeting the launch date drops below 50%. That threshold, the trigger, should be in the IMS as a watch item. Do not present SRA results as just a number. Present the confidence level, the top 3 schedule drivers, and the specific mitigation recommendations. That is what a decision maker can act on. The SRA is not a standalone analysis. It feeds the monthly risk review, informs management reserve planning, and must be updated at every major milestone and rebaseline. It is a living analytical product, not a one-time deliverable. The common challenges listed here are real problems I have encountered in programs. Poor IMS quality is the most common. Schedules that are not logic-linked cannot support a valid Monte Carlo simulation. Ignoring the correlation between simultaneous risks is the second most common. When 2 risks affect the same subsystem, their combined impact is not additive. Communicating insights rather than p-value numbers is the professional obligation. I have seen SRA presentations that show a 67% confidence level and nothing else. The program manager needs to know what is driving the shortfall and what can be done about it. The SRA brief should always end with a recommendation. Here is the confidence level. Here is what is driving it. Here is what we recommend doing about it. And here is when the decision needs to be made. This transition slide bridges from risk quantification to technical performance measurement. Understanding the risk posture is necessary but not sufficient. You also need to track whether the technical parameters that underlie the risk assumptions are trending in the right direction. QRAs and SRAs tell you about cost and schedule risk. TPMs tell you about technical risk. The three together give you the complete picture. A program that has a clean QRA but a degrading mass margin and power budget is a program with a risk problem that has not yet been reflected in the financial analysis. Technical performance measures are leading indicators. By the time a technical problem appears in the cost data, it has usually been visible in the TPM trends for months. The analyst who watches TPMs catches the cost event before it happens. Make sure your monthly review package includes key TPMs alongside the cost and schedule data. The integration of those 3 streams is what produces a genuine assessment. Technical performance measures are quantitative parameters that track how the system's technical attributes evolve relative to design margins and requirements. They are the connection between the engineering baseline and the program management picture. At JPL, the TPM tracking discipline was one of the things that separated well-run programs from struggling ones. Programs that tracked TPMs monthly and connected them to cost and schedule gave management early warning that could still be acted on. Programs that tracked them only at reviews were always surprised. The key phrase on this slide is established thresholds, not to be exceeded with built-in margin. Margin is not a buffer. It is a quantified allocation against measured uncertainty. When a margin is consumed faster than planned, it signals that the underlying technical uncertainty is greater than the model assumed. Every major technical parameter should have a threshold, a current value, a trend, and a forecast. If any of those four elements is missing, the TPM is not being managed. It is being reported. The list on this slide, mass/weight, power, data rate, lines of code, schedule reserve, and UFE usage, covers the full range of technical performance measures from physical hardware parameters to resource consumption metrics. Notice that schedule reserve and UFE usage are on this list alongside mass and power. That tells you something important. Resource margins are technical performance measures. Running out of schedule reserve is a technical performance failure, not just a management failure. The technical watch list concept is important. Not every parameter needs the same monitoring frequency or threshold sensitivity. The watch list prioritizes the parameters that are closest to their margins or trending in the wrong direction. Build a TPM watch list for every program you support. Identify the 3 to 5 parameters that are under the most pressure and track them weekly, not just monthly. Early detection of margin erosion is valuable. This expanded list adds bandwidth, the probability of crew or mission loss, milestone burn down, propellant margin, and other metrics to the basic watch list. The appropriate set of TPMs is mission-specific. Select the parameters most relevant to the technical risks of this program. The probability of crew or mission loss is the TPM that commands the most attention at any review involving human spaceflight. I've been in rooms where that single number drove more discussion than all the cost and schedule data combined, and appropriately so. The distinction between actual and estimated TPMs matters. Actual measurements, hardware mass, and power draw and test have higher confidence than estimated values that depend on models and assumptions. Know which category each of your TPMs falls into. When a program tells you a TPM looks fine, ask whether it is an actual or an estimate. An estimated mass margin that looks adequate based on an early model may tell a different story when the hardware is built and weighed. Rebaselines change TPMs. This is the point on this slide that programs most frequently miss. When a rebaseline occurs, whether from a scope change, a design change, or a schedule adjustment, the TPM baselines and thresholds need to be reviewed and potentially updated. I have seen programs where a mass margin that looked healthy was actually being artificially maintained because the baseline had been adjusted 3 times without a corresponding review of what the new margin implied for risk. The number looked good. The underlying situation had deteriorated. Knowing which metrics are actuals and which are estimates is not just a data quality question. It is a risk question. Estimated TPMs carry uncertainty that should feed back into the QRA. If the mass estimate has a 15% uncertainty range, the cost and schedule impacts of that uncertainty should be reflected somewhere in the risk register. After any rebaseline, conduct a full TPM review before closing the rebaseline action. Verify that the new margins are still consistent with the original design intent and that the risk register reflects any changes. A single data point tells you where you are. A trend tells you where you're going. For technical performance measures, the trend is almost always more important than the current reading. The example on this slide, a cost trend spike from an early contract issuance, illustrates why context matters. An abnormal change in a TPM is not automatically a problem. It may be explainable. The analyst's job is to determine whether an abnormal change is the signal it appears to be or a known artifact of program mechanics. Stability in a trend line for a TPM that should be consuming margin over time is itself a warning sign. If the power margin has been flat for 4 months during an active design period, either the design is unusually stable or the tracking is not current. For every TPM you track, establish what the expected trend shape should be over the program lifecycle. Then compare the actual trend to the expected. Divergence from the expected shape is the analytical trigger, not just proximity to a threshold. Early detection of threshold breaches allows the program team to be proactive. This is the core value of TPM tracking, not the measurement itself, but the lead time it creates between when a problem first becomes visible and when it becomes a crisis. The caution on this slide is equally important. Do not rely solely on technical data without cross-referencing with cost and schedule data. A mass margin breach without a corresponding cost event is unusual and warrants investigation. A mass margin breach that coincides with a cost increase and a schedule delay is the complete picture of a technical problem propagating into the program. Spending margin on technical issues is expected and manageable if it happens early. The same problem occurring late, after most of the margin has been consumed, has a completely different cost and schedule consequence profile. When you identify a TPM trend heading toward a threshold breach, immediately cross-check it against the risk register, cost trends, and schedule float. The integrated picture is what gives you the basis for a credible advisory. 3 trend types, leading, lagging, and current indicators, serve different analytical purposes. Leading indicators are predictive and prospective. Lagging indicators are historical and diagnostic. Current indicators show actual performance in real time. The most valuable indicators for PP&C analysis are leading indicators, but they are also the hardest to construct and validate. A true leading indicator gives you reliable advance notice. A false leading indicator that generates alerts on noise rather than signal creates analytical fatigue, causing real signals to be ignored. Using all 3 types together is the right approach. Leading indicators tell you where to look. Current indicators tell you what is happening now. Lagging indicators tell you whether your interventions are working. Each type answers a different question. When building your monthly review package, explicitly identify which metrics are leading, which are current, and which are lagging. Present them in that order. What are we seeing coming, what is happening now, and what has history been? That sequence tells a complete story. This example shows project status across multiple TPM dimensions simultaneously, the kind of integrated snapshot that gives a program manager a single-page view of where the technical, cost, and schedule indicators all stand at once. The integrated view is what distinguishes an assessment from a collection of reports. Individual metrics in isolation do not tell the program story. The story is in how they relate to each other, whether the mass trend, the cost trend, and the schedule trend are all pointing in the same direction or pulling in different directions. When you build a status summary like this, the analytical question is not just whether each indicator is in balance. It is whether the pattern of indicators makes sense as an integrated whole. Inconsistent patterns, a metric that looks good when every related metric looks bad, require investigation. Practice reading the integrated picture. Train yourself to see the relationships between the metrics, not just the individual readings. That is the analytical skill that earns you credibility in program reviews. Reserve utilization. The rate at which UFE and schedule reserve are being consumed relative to plan is one of the most important program health indicators available to a PP&C analyst. It integrates risk retirement, technical performance, and cost and schedule execution into a single trend. The plan line on this chart is as important as the actual line. A program that has a plan for reserve consumption, based on when risks are expected to be retired and when margin is expected to be spent, and is tracking close to that plan, is in a fundamentally different position than one consuming reserve without a plan. Reserve burn down ahead of plan in the early phases is a warning sign, even if the absolute reserve level appears adequate. Front-loaded reserve consumption without corresponding risk retirement means the program is using its buffer before it needs it, leaving nothing for the hard part. Every month, compare reserve consumption to the plan and to the risk of retirement. The 3 should move together. If UFE is being consumed but risks are not being retired, ask where the money is being spent. The Mars Exploration Rover Schedule Reserve Tracking example shows how a well-managed program maintains visibility into schedule margin consumption over time, with a plan baseline that allows the team to assess whether the consumption rate is appropriate at any given point. The MER program is one example I cite when programs ask what good looks like in reserve management. The tracking was disciplined, the plan was realistic, and when consumption accelerated beyond plan, the team knew it immediately and could respond. Schedule reserve tracking requires the same rigor as cost reserve tracking. A program that monitors UFE monthly but only reviews schedule float at milestone reviews is missing half the reserve picture. Cost and schedule margin must both be tracked continuously. Establish a schedule, reserve a tracking chart for every program you support. Baseline the expected consumption rate at the start of each phase, update it monthly, and brief it alongside the UFE burndown. Together, they give you the complete story of reserves. These 4 questions are: how are costs and schedule performing against TPMs? How do they compare to historical missions? How do cost expenditures align with key milestones? Is the workforce profile consistent with cost and schedule? And is the analyst integration checklist for the monthly review? The historical comparison question is the one most analysts skip. They have current program data and current program metrics. They lack historical context. At JPL, we maintain databases of prior mission performance specifically so that analysts could answer questions like, is this cost trend unusual for a program at this lifecycle position? Workforce profile consistency with cost and schedule is a check that catches a specific class of problem. Programs where the cost looks fine, but the wrong people are doing the wrong work at the wrong time. A workforce that is heavily loaded on systems engineering when the program should be in fabrication is a warning sign, even if the total dollars are on plan. These 4 questions should be answered in every monthly review package before you brief leadership. If any question cannot be answered, that gap is itself something leadership needs to know about.
These reserve-specific analysis questions complete the monthly checklist: reserve burndown percentage at key milestones, consistency with design principles, utilization categorization, and cost-to-go analysis of unencumbered UFE. The gold rules for reserve burndown percentages at key milestones are the benchmarks that make these questions answerable. Without them, reserve adequacy is a judgment call. With them, it is a calculation. Know your program's gold rules and apply them at every review. Categorizing UFE utilization, scope change, growth, risk buy-down, and schedule impact is not just accounting. It tells you whether the risk management process is working. UFE that is being consumed by risk retirement is the program working as designed. UFE consumed by unplanned scope growth is an entirely different signal. The cost-to-go unencumbered UFE percentage is the reserve health indicator that most programs underreport. By the time the total UFE number starts to look thin, the cost-to-go analysis has usually been showing the problem for months. Track it continuously.
QRAs, SRAs, and JCLs together quantify the program's risk posture. No single tool is sufficient alone. The JCL is the only instrument that truly assesses whether UFE is adequate because it integrates cost risk, schedule risk, and a reserve posture into a single probability statement. The objective, a complete list of risks with credible cost and schedule impact for each, is harder to achieve than it sounds. Most programs have incomplete risk registers, imprecise probability assignments, and cost impacts that do not reflect the actual consequences of occurrence. The analyst's job is to push for completeness and calibration, not to accept the register at face value. Different missions have different high-risk technical requirements. The TPMs and the risk register should be mission-specific. A risk register built on a template from a prior mission without review is a compliance document, not an analytical tool. Technical issues propagate into cost and schedule, driving UFE and margin consumption. The analyst who tracks technical performance, cost, schedule, and reserves as an integrated picture, not as 4 separate reports, is the analyst who sees the program's real situation clearly. This module concludes with a knowledge check designed to reinforce the key concepts of contract assessment. You'll apply what you've learned about contract types, contractor financial performance, margin, profit recognition, and cost analysis to realistic program scenarios. The goal is not simply to recall definitions, but to think like a PP&C professional by interpreting financial information, identifying potential concerns, and making informed assessment recommendations based on the data presented. Now that we've explored how risk influences program success, we'll turn our attention to contract assessment. In the next module, you'll learn how to evaluate contract structures, interpret contractor financial data, analyze workforce and cost performance, and understand how contract type affects program risk. We'll also examine the key reports and metrics PP&C professionals use to assess contractor performance and identify potential issues before they impact cost, schedule, or mission success.